Tuhis, Kanyon CoyoteWoman Sayers Roods. I'm just going to share a little presentation I made a few months ago and realizing I only was able to share it in that one location. So this is a quick little culture sharing opportunity. So the importance of culture sharing, talking about cultural resilience and responsiveness, I come into this circle, and culturally it is important that I share with you my lineage or my ancestry, and then we acknowledge the land where we are. So this presentation is made by yours truly, Kanyon CoyoteWoman Sayers Roods. I am a Mutsun Ohlone, Indigenous community and cultural representative of Indian Kanyon Nation. I am California native. I have some Chumash ancestry that I'm still learning about. I have Mohawk ancestry that I'm still learning about. And I have Uroma ancestry that I also am attempting to honor to the best of my ability. Mishmin Tuhis means good day in the Mutsun language. This is my mother, tribal chairwoman of Indian Kanyon Nation. We are the Indian Kanyon Mutsun Band of Costanoan Ohlone people. And Indian Kanyon is the only federally recognized Indian country between Sonoma and Santa Barbara along central coastal California. That being said, we have Indian country. However, we are not tribally recognized by the federal government. The Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, along central coastal California, is identified in some documents either by the word Costanoan or the word Ohlone. Both of these are misnomers. The Spaniards called us Costaños, and the term Ohlone is an indigenous term from a single village site called Ohlone, and that is by San Gregorio, and that is one location, and over time it got documented. And so when we think about how deeply we've been impacted by colonization, imagine all of the teachers out there who are saying the Ohlone tribe. There is no such thing. However, because of complacency and the struggle around honoring truth in history is so challenging that we have to find what works. It is important that we learn about the indigenous peoples of the land that we are on, and over time we learn better ways to identify the communities, cultures, histories, diverse perspectives of these truths. Over time, different communities will use different terms. Similar as I, as a millennial, as a digital native, do not like the word Indian. Yet my uncle, who was born in the 50s, is very proud of being an Indian. It's as simple as that. It's both a culture and it's a time and it's an identifier. And when we learn more ways to honor truth in history, there are different ways that we can present ourselves and identify ourselves. One project that I have been so happy to be a part of has been a mini documentary by Rucha Chitnis, In the Land of My Ancestors. It is a 10-minute documentary sharing the perspective of my mother and Indian Kanyon. And it has been an honor to work with Rucha, and I feel very blessed to share this perspective because honoring my mother's legacy is so very important to me. I find it very important that community members take time to share perspective, and infographics are one way. It is amazing how many people try and dismiss indigenous perspectives by continuing paper genocide and cultural denial. Whenever people refer to indigenous peoples, they use the narrative, the colonial narrative, that they have been fed most of their lifetime with America's current and ongoing oppressive tactic of educating the community, calling indigenous peoples primitive, or savages, or dirty, or dismissing traditional ecological knowledge, dismissing the pedagogies that indigenous peoples have been stewarding the land since time immemorial, dismissing so many beautiful governing systems, creation stories, communal value systems, and legacies. It is frustrating because we as humans have impacted the earth dramatically, and the greatest part of the devastation that has occurred dominantly in the past, 150 to 300 years. Oh, that seems to be around the time that colonization started ramping up, when different nations started colliding, which I'm not dismissing that. I would not be who I am today had these historical occurrences not occurred. However, I recognize colonization as being deeply impactful to the well-being of the earth and our methodology of going forward, both with capitalism and our materialistic approaches to this disposable society, our prioritization of economic-driven value systems, and exploitation and resource extraction of both the earth, cultural resources, and communities, bodies, is not a sustainable model. If you zoom out, if you stretch your arms across, that could be the timeline of humanity. The element of truth is, if you look at your fingernail, that could be the history of the development of different communities, governing structures, and that window of time is when more human interaction was transpiring, such as ships traveling and more oppressive warfare tactics of communities clashing with other communities and taking over. So the impact of colonization is just the fingernail. And then when we get to the white part of our fingernail, that is when people came to the Americas and the history of the Americas transpired. And whenever we are thinking about our education system, whose perspective is being shared, and what is the timeline? So many times only that fingernail, that crescent tip of the fingernail, is what's being discussed. Possibly 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue? It's been 530 years. Can we recite who he ran into? Can we acknowledge the language that they spoke? Can we acknowledge their neighbors and their language that they spoke? Can we identify their sacred mountains and their sacred waters? Do you know anything about the bioregion? If we cannot recite this, and we've prioritized an external narrative validating that colonization and oppressing other cultures, because supposedly the oppressive tactic, the community with the strongest warfare, the community who believed it was right, has the pejorative in presenting that truth and that narrative. How are we honoring truth in history and offering the perspectives of the community? So this is just a little bit of information that I like to share. And of course, the Bering Strait theory is always frustrating because it is just that. It is a theory. So when we think about challenging the dominant colonial narrative, it's quite frustrating because, when I was going to school and I told people I was Native, the first time that occurred, a young boy said, when I was about 5, a young boy said, "If you're Indian, you're dead." That was painful to me. So, was it him who was wrong? Well, who taught him? Was it his mother, his father? Was it the school? Was there any cultural competency or cultural sensitivity around that kind of interaction? Was there any restorative justice? Was it just valid for him to say that and move along? Well, that is what transpired, and that is partially what has motivated me to continue sharing my perspective around honoring truth in history. Here in California, we have over 90 languages, over 250 dialects. And in each of those areas, these different dialects are different ways that the community operated and went through the community. These are different pedagogies, these are different governing structures, different ways that communities operated in the world. All these different languages had different creation stories. And whenever I was in school, many people didn't know about California natives, and that's very frustrating. The image on the right is my friend Amanda Lee Julius, and this was a museum exhibition that was presented in either 2014 or 15 at Monterey Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. And I was quite frustrated with it because a lot of the presented material had been historic and archived material, so I understand the importance of citing sources. I understand the importance of presenting the data that has been presented, understanding the colonial narrative, which is quite frustrating because most of the time it's not by Indigenous peoples, and it's people using Western colonial science, which this Western settler colonial mindset tends to prioritize breaking apart, putting together, like kind of like scientific theory, break apart, put together, see how it works. The problem with that is there is limited opportunity to observe holistic systems. There's limited opportunity to understand and respect the difference between qualitative and quantitative data. And so with this museum curation being presented and citing sources, it is citing sources that are misinformed. Because over time, science and ways of observing historical materials and scientific observations evolves. So in the past, when there was carbon dating, it would be dated only so many years. Same thing with how science is observed. How I witness archaeological data, it's very patriarchal. It tends to prioritize tool making and the observation of how the tools came to exist. Primitive observation of these tools, validating that possibly men created them and that the development of society is equal to that of which how the tools were developed, which is a very limited perspective. And so with this presented material in the 21st century, having it cite other materials, it is saying Monterey's history began 5,000 years ago. Now there's a problem with that. I work with archaeological firms who have validated that there are archaeologically sensitive areas over 9,000 years old in the Bay Area. Yet, this material exists as a valid citable source. This material is presented to the public as educational. This material is part of the paper genocide against Indigenous peoples. And that is what I struggle with. Some work that I am happy to have worked on is sharing perspectives about land acknowledgements. I was happy to be on a panel with my relatives, my California Indigenous relatives, Karina Gould and Greg Castro. The co-organizer was Lenita Warjack, who was one of the first occupiers of Alcatraz in the 1969 occupation. And it is really wonderful to see San Francisco State University share an opportunity of sharing perspective of Indigenous peoples by living Indigenous peoples. And I'm happy to be a part of that. This happens to be me sharing that I'm a digital native, technology and tech, traditional ecological knowledge, ingenuity and ingenuity. These are two gifts. However, in this presentation, I can't show them off. So one is dropping the Mutsun Ohlone coloring book, and another is Re-Indigenize. And they're just repeating gifts showing that we're in the 21st century. I have developed a mini-zine for free. It is a little pamphlet of information sharing ways that we can honor truth in history. A single piece of paper can be folded into an 8-page mini-zine, and the information on it is priceless. It is a fun way to both have a tactile, educational piece of material that could be shared or handed out or learned. And in it has a map about Ohlone territory. It shares tidbits about Indigenous Protocol, ways to honor native land, talking about land acknowledgements, sharing ways that we can have culture sharing opportunities, respecting all life, ways that we can respect lives lived and gifts given. I introduced that I started a consultation firm dedicated to bridging the gap between Indigenous and contemporary value systems, Kanyon Consulting LLC, both with K's, so I'm #KKLLC, happens to be an Indigenous-led and owned organization that is focused on talking about decolonization, cultural competency, Indigenous perspectives, so celebrating oral narratives, talking about restorative justice, talking about decolonization and re-indigenization, and bringing these things into our community value systems, bringing these perspectives into everyday life and everyday working environments. And that's with any organization. You can find ways to honor Indigenous pedagogies. We can all learn ways to stand in solidarity with Indigenous values, to honor truth and history about the land that we have settled on and live on, and ways that we can be present in community to go forward in a good way. Kanyon Consulting has also offered perspective in the form of written materials. So Kanyon Consulting is published in a few different written articles and books. So this happens to be a knitting book for San Francisco. And the individual who authored this wanted to be sure that there was an accountable way to acknowledge the land and the communities that are of the land, and ways to identify them in a respectful fashion. So we created a land acknowledgement that segued into talking about knitting. So that is a fun way that perspective is being shared. So this is just a little bit. And Komsanak Kanis, which in the Mutsun language means thank you, or quite literally, it pleases me. Because when it comes to language revitalization, there are different ways that perspectives and ways that we understand these words and ways that communities of the past would communicate. So I am honored to share this with you, and check out more information at canyonconsulting.com or indiancanyonlife.org.